So, I will discuss intersectionality and I'll talk about race, class, gender, and violence. And I'll draw on the scholarship of Kimberly Crenshaw. And I'll also make reference to some of the aspects of the readings for this week, particularly the interview with Margaret Mead and James Baldwin. This is a clip about Margaret Mead, who was a famous anthropologist whose work you might have heard of. And the interview is between Mead and James Baldwin, the famous poet.
When we use the word modern to describe something, it's usually a positive. We're very appreciative and even a little smug about the miracles of modern science, modern technology, and even the superiority of modern viewpoints. But what if, in speeding towards a new and ever better future, we've left some important truths about ourselves behind? One of the people who best helps us to explore this problem is Margaret Mead, perhaps the most famous anthropologist in the world. Margaret Mead was born in the USA in 1901, the oldest of 5 children. Her father was a professor of finance and her mother was a sociologist. After studying psychology as an undergraduate, Mead began a PhD in the relatively new field of anthropology. Her supervisor, Franz Boas, was the founder of the discipline in the United States. Unlike earlier anthropologists who'd imagined that civilization was progressing in a linear fashion from barbarism to savagery to civilization, Boas argued that the world was teeming with separate cultures, each with their own unique perspectives, insights, and deficiencies. The modern Western world was not the pinnacle of human achievement, but simply one specific example of what humans could get up to. Boas suggested that Mead travel for her fieldwork to Samoa, a few tiny volcanic tropical islands in the center of the Pacific Ocean. Mead was particularly interested in primitive communities because she believed that such isolated cultures could serve as laboratories that would reveal ways of living that the modern world had forgotten about but needed to remember. Starting in 1925 and lasting until the beginning of the Second World War, Mead lived in Samoa in a highly authentic way for long periods. She learnt the languages, dressed like a local, and even carried babies around by having them cling to her neck. Mead became fascinated by Samoan attitudes to sex in particular. In the book that made her name, Coming of Age in Samoa, published in 1928, Mead described Samoan culture as far more open and comfortable with sex than the modern United States. Little children in Samoa knew all about masturbation and learned about intercourse and other acts through first-hand observation, but thought of it as no more scandalous or worthy of comment than death or birth. Homosexuality was incidental, but also not a matter of shame, and people's orientations fluctuated naturally throughout their lives, without defining them. This intrigued and inspired Mead, who herself led a rather unconventional life, simultaneously involved with successive husbands and an ever-present female lover, another famous anthropologist called Ruth Benedict. Mead argued that the Samoan approach to sex made adolescence far easier for girls there, because there was little pressure for them to conform to particular kinds of sexuality. They were neither pressured to abstain from sex, nor to achieve particular milestones like having boyfriends or getting married. Gradually, Mead got interested in gender roles and discovered that modern societies are far more rigid in this area than primitive ones. For example, Americans tend to think of men as productive, sensible, and aggressive, while women are often told that they're more frivolous, peaceful, and nurturing. But in her 1935 book, Sex and Temperament in Three Primitive Societies, Mead studied tribes in Papua New Guinea and recorded that in the Arapesh tribe, both men and women were peaceful and nurturing, while among the Mundagamore tribe, men and women were both ruthless and aggressive. In short, Mead suggested that no gender traits are ever simply human nature. They're all instead simply possibilities, which are either taught, encouraged, or shunned by any given culture. Mead's striking conclusion is that it isn't gender that makes women curl their hair or listen to people's feelings, or race that makes some nations regularly attack their neighbors. Rather, it's the social expectations and norms that have developed slowly over centuries and which have laid the groundwork for each individual's psychological makeup. We must recognize, she reminded her readers, that beneath the superficial classifications of sex and race, the same potentialities always exist, recurring generation after generation, only to perish because society has no place for them. Mead herself learned so much from her anthropological subjects. She brought up her daughter according to some of the parenting ideas of the primitive people she worked with, like breastfeeding on demand, which she helped to popularize in modern-day America. During World War II, access to the South Pacific was impossible, so Mead began to study more complex cultures like her own. After the war, Mead worked for the US military, studying Russian responses to authority in order to try to predict what the Soviets might do during the Cold War. She grew increasingly famous, traveling widely, giving lectures and teaching at universities. For 50 years, from 1928 until her death in 1978, she worked on and off for the American Museum of Natural History in New York City as a curator for their special projects. She wrote 20 books in all and was awarded 28 honorary degrees. Mead's work helps us to use the experiences of other nations and people as a storehouse of good ideas. As the traveller who has once been from home is wiser than he who's never left his own doorstep, she suggested, so a knowledge of another culture will always sharpen our ability to scrutinize our own more steadily. In doing so, she suggested, we will always uncover and support undeveloped human potential, forgotten in our rush towards modernity.
How to Think More Effectively is a book about how to optimize our minds so that they can more regularly.
So I'll discuss 3 ideas in the lecture. Firstly, intersectionality, structural, political, and representational intersectionality. Then I'll talk about the suppression of Black feminist thought. And finally, I'll finish by discussing Black feminist standpoint theory. Firstly, intersectionality, structural, political, and representational. Structural intersectionality for Kimberly Crenshaw discusses the ways in which institutions are structured around ideas of singularity and privilege. So the term intersectionality makes reference to a legal case, and it was the case of Emma DeGaffney. And Emma DeGaffney is a Black woman who really wanted a job in the United States of America. But when employers hired women, they hired white women. And when they hired Black people, they hired Black men. So Emma DeGaffney was a Black woman who could not find a job. And Kimberly Crenshaw then discusses the case from the perspective of a lawyer and an academic who is interested in economic justice and in labor laws. And Crenshaw argues that oppression doesn't work singularly. It often works intersectionally. And those who experience multiple oppressions, like being a person with a disability and a woman and a person of color, all of these work intersectionally. And it often means that people who experience multiple oppressions are most likely to be unemployed or to be underemployed and to be discriminated against. So Crenshaw writes, I observed the dynamics of structural intersectionality during a brief field of study of battered women's shelters located in minority communities in Los Angeles. In most cases, the physical assault that leads women to these shelters is merely the most immediate manifestation of the subordination they experience. Many women who seek protection are unemployed or underemployed, and a good number of them are poor. So this is a clip of Kimberly Crenshaw.
I'd like to try something new. Those of you who are able, please stand up. Okay, so I'm gonna name some names. When you hear a name that you don't recognize, you can't tell me anything about them, I'd like you to take a seat and stay seated. The last person standing, we're going to see what they know, okay? All right. Eric Garner, Mike Brown, Tamir
Oh, I won't go to full screen.
Rice,
Cool.
Freddie Gray. So those of you who are still standing, I'd like you to turn around and take a look. I'd say half to most of the people are still standing. So let's continue. Michelle Cusseau. Tanisha Anderson. Ara Russer. Megan Hockaday. So if we look around again, there are about 4 people still standing. And actually, I'm not going to put you on the spot. I just say that to encourage transparency, so you can be seated. So those of you who recognize the first group of names know that these were African Americans who've been killed by the police over the last 2.5 years. What you may not know is that the other list is also African Americans who have been killed within the last 2 years. Only one thing distinguishes the names that you know from the names that you don't know: gender. So let me first let you know that there's nothing at all distinct about this audience that explains the pattern of recognition that we've just seen. I've done this exercise dozens of times around the country. I've done it to women's rights organizations. I've done it with civil rights groups. I've done it with professors. I've done it with students. I've done it with psychologists. I've done it with sociologists. I've done it even with progressive members of Congress. And everywhere, the awareness of the level of police violence that Black women experience is exceedingly low. Now, it is surprising, isn't it, that this would be the case? I mean, there are 2 issues involved here. There's police violence against African Americans, and there's violence against women, 2 issues that have been talked about a lot lately. But when we think about who is implicated by these problems, when we think about who's victimized by these problems, the names of these Black women never come to mind. Now, communications experts tell us that when facts do not fit with the available frames, people have a difficult time incorporating new facts into their way of thinking about a problem. These women's names have slipped through our consciousness because there are no frames for us to see them, no frames for us to remember them, no frames for us to hold them. As a consequence, reporters don't lead with them, policymakers don't think about them, and politicians aren't encouraged or demanded that they speak to them. Now, you might ask, well, why does a frame matter? I mean, after all, an issue that affects Black people and an issue that affects women, wouldn't that necessarily include Black people who are women and women who are Black people? Well, the simple answer is that this is a trickle-down approach to social justice, and many times it just doesn't work. Without frames that allow us to see how social problems impact all the members of a targeted group, many will fall through the cracks of our movement, left to suffer in virtual isolation. But it doesn't have to be this way. Many years ago, I began to use the term intersectionality to deal with the fact that many of our social justice problems like racism and sexism are often overlapping, creating multiple levels of social injustice. Now, the experience that gave rise to intersectionality was my chance encounter with a woman named Emma de Graffenried. Emma de Graffenried was an African-American woman, a working wife, and a mother. I actually read about Emma's story from the pages of a legal opinion written by a judge who had dismissed Emma's claim of race and gender discrimination against a local car manufacturing plant. Emma, like so many African-American women, sought better employment for her family and for others. She wanted to create a better life for her children and for her family. But she applied for a job and she was not hired. And she believed that she was not hired because she was a Black woman. Now, the judge in question dismissed Emma's suit. And the argument for dismissing the suit was that the employer did hire African Americans and the employer hired women. The real problem, though, that the judge was not willing to acknowledge was what Emma was actually trying to say, that the African Americans that were hired, usually for industrial jobs, maintenance jobs, were all men. And the women that were hired, usually for secretarial or front office work, were all white. Only if the court was able to see how these policies came together would he be able to see the double discrimination that Emma de Graffenried was facing. But the court refused to allow Emma to put two causes of action together to tell her story because he believed that by allowing her to do that, she would be able to have preferential treatment. She'd have an advantage by being able to have two swings at the bat when African-American men and white women only had one swing at the bat. But of course, neither African-American men or white women needed to combine a race and gender discrimination claim to tell the story of the discrimination they were experiencing. Why wasn't the real unfairness law's refusal to protect African-American women simply because their experiences weren't exactly the same as white women and African-American men? Rather than broadening the frame to include African-American women, the court simply tossed their case completely out of court. Now, as a student of anti-discrimination law, as a feminist, as an anti-racist, I was struck by this case. It felt to me like injustice squared. So first of all, Black women weren't allowed to work at the plant. Second of all, the court doubled down on this exclusion by making it legally inconsequential. And to boot, there was no name for this problem. And we all know that where there's no name for a problem, you can't see a problem. And when you can't see a problem, you pretty much can't solve it. Many years later, I'd come to recognize that the problem that Emma was facing was a framing problem. The frame that the court was using to see gender discrimination or to see race discrimination was partial and it was distorting. For me, the challenge that I faced was trying to figure out whether there was an alternative narrative, a prism that would allow us to see Emma's dilemma, a prism that would allow us to rescue her from the cracks in the law, that would allow judges to see her story. So it occurred to me, maybe a simple analogy to an intersection might allow judges to better see Emma's dilemma. So if we think about this intersection, the roads to the intersection would be the way that the workforce was structured by race and by gender. And then the traffic in those roads would be the hiring policies and the other practices that ran through those roads. Now, because Emma was both Black and female, she was positioned precisely where those roads overlapped, experiencing the simultaneous impact of the company's gender and race traffic. The law was like that ambulance that shows up and is ready to treat Emma only if it can be shown that she was harmed on the race road or on the gender road, but not where those roads intersected. So what do you call being impacted by multiple forces and then abandoned to fend for yourself? Intersectionality seemed to do it for me. I would go on to learn that African-American women, like other women of color, like other socially marginalized people all over the world, were facing all kinds of dilemmas and challenges as a consequence of intersectionality, intersections of race and gender, of heterosexism, transphobia, xenophobia, ableism. All of these social dynamics come together and create challenges that are sometimes quite unique. But in the same way that intersectionality raised our awareness to the way that Black women live their lives, it also exposes the tragic circumstances under which African-American women die. Police violence against Black women is very real. The level of violence that Black women face is such that it's not surprising that some of them do not survive their encounters with police. Black girls as young as 7, great-grandmothers as old as 95 have been killed by the police. They've been killed in their living rooms, in their bedrooms. They've been killed in their cars. They've been killed on the street. They've been killed in front of their parents, and they've been killed in front of their children. They have been shot to death. They have been stomped to death. They have been suffocated to death. They have been manhandled to death. They have been tasered to death. They've been killed when they've called for help. They've been killed when they were alone, and they've been killed when they were with others. They have been killed shopping while Black, driving while Black, having a mental disability while Black, having a domestic disturbance while Black. They've even been killed being homeless while Black. They've been killed talking on the cell phone, laughing with friends, sitting in a car reported as stolen, and making a U-turn in front of the White House with an infant strapped in the backseat of the car. Why don't we know these stories? Why is it that their lost lives don't generate the same amount of media attention and communal outcry as the lost lives of their fallen brothers? It's time for a change. So what can we do? In 2014, the African American Policy Forum began to demand that we say her name at rallies, at protests, at conferences, at meetings, anywhere and everywhere that state violence against Black bodies is being discussed. But saying her name is not enough. We have to be willing to do more. We have to be willing to bear witness to the often painful realities that we would just rather not confront. The everyday violence and humiliation that many Black women have had to face. Black women across color, age, gender expression, sexuality, and ability. So we have the opportunity right now, bearing in mind that some of the images that I'm about to share with you may be triggering for some, to collectively bear witness to some of this violence. We're going to hear the voice of the phenomenal Abby Dobson. And as we sit with these women, some who've experienced violence and some who have not survived them, we have an opportunity to reverse what happened at the beginning of this talk, when we could not stand for these women because we did not know their names. So at the end of this clip, there's going to be a roll call. Several Black women's names will come up. I'd like those of you who are able to join us in saying these names as loud as you can, randomly, disorderly. Let's create a cacophony of sound to represent our intention to hold these women up, to sit with them, to bear witness to them, to bring them into the light. Say her name. Say her name. Say all her name shall never know. I asked Sarah Jones, Teresa Fonville, Catherine Johnson, Kayla Moore, Michelle Bissell, Rakia Boyd, Shelley Frey, Tarika, Yvette Smith. So I said at the beginning, if we can't see a problem, we can't fix a problem. Together, we've come together to bear witness to these women's lost lives. But the time now is to move from mourning and grief to action and transformation. This is something that we can do. It's up to us.
Let's stop it there. One of the problems with intersectionality and with Marxism is that David Roediger wrote a book called The Wages of Whiteness. And Roediger argues that it is often the white working class who trade on this kind of wage of whiteness in order to propagate racism and to be white as a form of psychological wage. So in The Wage of Whiteness, what David Roediger argues is that working class white people can be white and can enjoy the privileges of whiteness as a wage, which will not be an actual material wage that would increase their class position, but will make them feel as though they belong to America, hence the rise of white nationalism. So class solidarity becomes impossible because of an investment in white supremacy. Crenshaw therefore argues that immigrant women and Black women are often the most vulnerable people in North America because they experience discrimination because they are not white, but also they experience discrimination in religious and nationalist or ethno-nationalist ethnic communities and families as women. So immigrant women are also vulnerable to spousal violence because so many of them depend on their husbands for information regarding their legal status. Many women who are now permanent residents continue to suffer abuse under threats of deportation by their husbands. Even if the threats are unfounded, women who have no independent access to information will still be intimidated by such threats. So, sexual violence and domestic violence is also an issue of race and racial discrimination, or is also an issue that is different depending upon privileges of race. Women of color occupy positions both physically and culturally marginalized within dominant society, and so information must be targeted directly to them in order to reach them. Accordingly, rape crisis centers must earmark more resources for basic information dissemination in communities of color than in white ones. Second form of intersectionality discussed by Crenshaw is political intersectionality. The concept of political intersectionality highlights the fact that women of color are situated within at least two subordinated groups that frequently pursue conflicting political agendas. Racism, as experienced by people of color who are of a particular gender, male, tends to determine the parameters of anti-racist strategy, just as sexism, as experienced by women who are of a particular race, white, ground the women's movement. The problem is not simply that these discourses fail women of color by not acknowledging the additional issues, race, or patriarchy, but that the discourses are often inadequate. So a good example is the election of Kamala Harris. So when Kamala Debbie Harris appeared on the cover of a fashion magazine after her electoral victory, the reactions really were expressive, and it is Vogue. So she was on the cover of Vogue, and the reactions are really expressive of the impossible position of being a Black Indian woman and vice president. And on the one hand, commentators discussed sexism, and they discussed the ways that fashion often objectifies the female body, and yet the body that often appears in fashion historically is a white female body. They also discussed the ways that Vogue is a very bourgeoisie publication, and yet when people have included Black workers in the American workforce, they have included Black men. So these kind of critiques are constant efforts to insult women of color, but they also kind of involve these laments on the part of white women who have been objectified, and these laments on the part of Black men who have always been included as part of the left wing. And so they are not really critiques or complaints. They become insulting because they further express the refusal on the part of white women to consider their privileges of race and Black men to consider their privileges of gender. Ultimately, I would argue that eugenics is one of the ways that one could consider the specific and acute oppressions of non-white, non-Christian women. So eugenics is a brand of Nazi science that often prevented certain women from giving birth to children as a way of promoting the interest of the white Christian race. And eugenics was popular among the Nazis. Eugenic science has also been used to sterilize many Indigenous women in Canada. So the representation of this Black woman on the cover of Vogue is really, I think, about eugenics, and the anxieties that it caused are eugenic anxieties, because she is an affluent woman of color who whose image could lead to mimicry and could therefore lead to more non-white women giving birth to children in America, and also immigrating to America. This would change the face of the future. So representational intersectionality refers to an analysis of what may be termed representational intersectionality, and it would include these images that are produced through a confluence of race and gender, as well as a recognition of how racist and sexist representation marginalize women of color. This is another clip about intersection. And this again, Kimberly Crenshaw.
I'm Sarah Hyatt in Lafayette College. I'd like to welcome Professor Kimberly Crenshaw. She is a professor of law at UCLA and Columbia University, and an expert in the field of civil rights, Black feminist legal theory, and race, racism, and the law. On top of that, she's also the director of the Center of Intersectionality and Social Policy at Columbia University, which she co-founded in 2011, and also the co-founder of the African American Policy Forum. On top of that, she's the creator of intersectionality theory. We're so glad to have you.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
And speaking of intersectionality, that actually leads us right into our first question. For the students who may not know, what is intersectionality? Can you define that for us?
Well, I have to practice my elevator version of it, but intersectionality is basically the idea that we experience life, sometimes discrimination, sometimes benefits, based on a number of different identities that we have. So the basic term came out of a case where I was looking at Black women who were being discriminated against, not just as Black people, not just as women, but as Black women. So intersectionality was basically a metaphor to say, well, they've got race discrimination that they're facing coming from one direction. They've got gender discrimination coming from another direction, and they're colliding in their lives in ways that we don't really anticipate and understand. So intersectionality is basically meant to help people think about the fact that discrimination can happen on the basis of several different factors at the same time. We need to have a language and ability to see it in order to address it.
I know my journey to women's and gender studies was based on intersectional factors. Like, I'm Jewish and I'm a woman, and and being raised in a Reformed Jewish family with a female rabbi was a huge really informed my feminism. Yeah. And I was wondering, what was your journey to women's and gender studies and
intersectionality? That's a wonderful question. So I was raised by a mother and father who were deeply involved in the civil rights movement. We talked about social justice at the dinner table every day. When I came home, my friends used to tease me because I had to study for dinner. Like, my parents wanted me to talk about, what did you learn today? What did you observe today? How do you defend what you think?
No pressure.
No pressure, exactly. So that's the household that I grew up in. And my mother is what I guess in the last century we used to call race women. They're women who were deeply committed to the idea of racial justice, and they were committed to fighting for the rights of people of color, including and especially women. So she would talk about some of the ways that racism gets experienced by Black people who are women, not just Black people who are men. And basically give me tools to see when it was coming at me. So, different ways that you might be spoken to as a Black woman as opposed to being a white woman, having to keep your eye out for harassing behavior at work. And sexual harassment actually came from Black women's employment experience. The first plaintiffs were Black women because these are kind of things that would happen to Black women in the workforce. So just the general way in which you're a woman, but not quite the kind of woman that you're supposed to be. These are the kinds of things that my mom taught me about. So I had sort of a race lens from the family as a whole, and then my mother would talk more specifically about, now as a woman, these are the things that you're gonna have to look out for. So I was kind of naturally drawn by the time I got to college, both to Africana studies, which I was one of my majors, and the other major was government. And then I did a minor in women's studies.
To go back to what you said about your parents, that they are involved in the civil rights movement, and nowadays there's kind of this resurgence of Black Lives Matter. But the names that stand out in the Black Lives Matter movement and get the most attention are Eric Garner, Trayvon Martin, and Michael Brown, but we don't see like the Yvette Smiths or the Renisha McBrides. And why do you think that is, that the Black women who are also suffering from systemic violence are getting kind of pushed under the rug, not getting that national attention?
Yes. Well, it's an issue that I've been very much concerned with, and it was one of the reasons we started Say Her Name, to draw attention to the names that people don't have. They don't roll off the lips. We don't know the names of Tanisha Anderson and Michelle Cusseau. I've thought a little bit about why this is the case, and I can share that we have been participating in some of the marches. We were participating, for example, in the Eric Garner March when we came up with Say Her Name, because a part of the march is you're marching and you're lifting up the names. And so then we started saying some of the women's names, and people were looking at us like, "What are you talking about?" And so that's why we just said, "Well, just say her name, right? Just say it," because saying it brings attention to the fact that there are women who are also killed by the police. We eventually created a big banner that had the names and the photos of 20 Black women who were killed by the police. And for a while we were marching in the march with it, but we realized that actually the poster needed to be seen by people in the march. So we came out of the march and stood on the side of the road and held up the banner so people walking by would see it. And we noticed that some people gave us the thumbs up. A lot of people were just it didn't compute. The idea of women being killed by the police was just something they'd never imagined. And so they would come over and they took pictures and wanted to know about the stories. And then there were a few people who, were like this, right? This is not about women killed by the police. This is about Black men killed by the police. And that goes somewhat to your question. I think that there's a framing of the problem of police violence that's largely influenced by an idea that this is about competing masculinities. This is about, the state, or basically some men clothed with the power of the state trying to constrain, individuals that are seen as hyper-masculine, out of control, and therefore in need of coercive punishment. And there is an element of police violence that is informed by that, but that's not the only aspect of police killings that we have to worry about. So in the same way that lynching, for example, was often framed as an assault on Black male sexuality, which many times it was also the cover for many other things that other people were subject to, including Black women who were also lynched. So we've been trying to broaden the frame so people can see how state violence is rationalized by a lot of different stereotypes. But the most important one that Black women share is that as Black people, more of a threat to the police, more likely to engage in conduct that puts police officers' lives at risk, and more in need of harsh disciplinary kind of coercive physical punishment. And we see this in cases that Black women have experienced in their homes, in their bedrooms, around the corner from where they live, in their cars, everywhere.
You kind of hinted at this, but one of the biggest critiques of Black Lives Matter is that all lives should matter. What would be your response to that?
Yeah, well, that's the Black Lives Matter popular version of colorblindness, right? We can't speak with any particularity about the risks that certain things will happen to people who are embodied in particular way, because to do that is to exclude all the other people, right? So, one of the most tremendously troubling things that happened after the civil rights movement is the way that some of the victories of the civil rights movement have been turned on their head. So, Brown versus Board of Education now has been twisted into an idea that it is discriminatory to take into account race at all in school assignments, even if race is being taken into account to continue the process of desegregation, right? So the idea is everybody is similarly situated with respect to race. That's part of the idea behind all lives matter. Like everybody is similarly situated with respect to the likelihood that they'll be driving down the street one day and a police officer will, interrupt their day and they might end up in handcuffs or worse. It just is not the case that everyone is similarly situated with respect to this. And if it were to happen to people at the same rates that it's happening to Black people, if it were to happen to white people, the responses, I think we have plenty of reason to believe, will be different. So this is all of the background that makes Black Lives Matter something to say. It's being said because the evidence suggests that they don't. So it's aspirational. Black lives should matter the same as everybody else. So just erasing what is being said by saying they all do is just denying exactly what the circumstance is, which is they're hugely different risks and circumstances of being encountered by the police. And that's what Black Lives Matter is trying to politicize.
That's great. Thank you so much. And thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Well, thank you for the wonderful questions.
It's my pleasure. It was really, I'm so excited to get to meet you.
Thank you. Thank you.
So Black feminist thought has been suppressed historically. Hill Collins writes that Afro-American women have long been privy to some of the most intimate secrets of white society. Countless numbers of Black women have ridden buses to their white families, where they not only cooked, cleaned, and executed other domestic duties, but where they also nurtured their other children, shrewdly offered guidance to their employers, and frequently became honorary members of the white family. So we've discussed epistemic violence extensively, and we've talked about the ways that knowledge is often produced from the vantage point of the most privileged people, and the kind of knowledge that is produced by marginalized people, by working class people, by the poor, is not seen to be valid knowledge. And this is what Spivak terms epistemic violence. And so the suppression of Black feminist thought is something that Patricia Hill Collins discusses extensively. Firstly, the exploitation of Black women's labor, and writing and testimonials regarding labor exploitation of Black women is often suppressed within North American media, popular culture, universities, literature, statistics. The exploitation of Black women's labor, essential to US capitalism, the iron pots and kettles, symbolizing Black women's long-standing ghettoization and service occupations, represents the economic dimension of oppression. Survival for most African American women has been such an all-consuming activity. The most have had few opportunities to do intellectual work, as it has been traditionally defined. The drudgery of enslaved African American women's work and the grinding poverty of free wage labor in the rural South tellingly illustrates the high cost of Black women that Black women have paid for survival. Secondly, there's a political dimension of oppression that's denied African American women the rights and privileges routinely extended to white male citizens. Forbidding Black women to vote, excluding African Americans and women from public office, and withholding equitable treatments to the criminal justice system all substantiate the political subordination of Black women. Finally, controlling images applied to Black women that originated during slavery attest to the ideological dimensions of US Black women's oppression. So images of mammies, Jezebels, the breeder women of slavery, smiling Aunt Jemimas on pancake boxes, ubiquitous Black prostitutes, and ever-present welfare mothers, all construct negative images of Black women, an archive of negative images that one can draw upon in order to formulate stereotypical images of strangers, of people who are misrepresented in the media in ways that often justify oppression, wrongly justify oppression, and allow one to have fantasies that do not correspond with the law. So finally, Patricia Hill Collins in Black Feminist Thought discusses the importance of self-definition and self-evaluation. So when one is subject to false stereotypes, discrimination, harassment, violence, abuse, self-definition and self-evaluation, self-affirmation becomes extremely important. An affirmation of the importance of Black women's self-determination and self-valuation is the first key theme that pervades historical and contemporary statements of Black feminist thought. Self-definition involves challenging the political knowledge validation process that has resulted in externally defined stereotypical images of Afro-American womanhood. And Hill Collins writes of the ways that Black women are constantly mocked and ridiculed as mothers, as workers. And so self-valuation involves a serious form of self-esteem. And self-valuation also involves resisting dehumanization and resisting dehumanizing treatment. Psychological oppression is central to sexism and to racism, and specifically to racialized forms of misogyny or sexism, or what is referred to as misogynoir, misogyny against Black women. The potential damage of internalized control to Afro-American women's self-esteem can be great, even to the prepared. Enduring frequent assaults of controlling images requires considerable inner strength. The second reason that Black female self-identification and self-valuation are significant concerns their value in allowing African American women to reject internalized psychological oppression. So having a strong sense of self also protects one's mental health. So Black feminist standpoint theory is then a series of theories and theoretical claims and philosophies that bring that originate from the positionality of Black women and Black feminists. So I'll finish, and Black feminist thought can be viewed as subjugated knowledge in the same way that we discussed Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak, and knowledge produced on the part of those who are often not heard or who ignored. Black feminist thought is similarly subjugated knowledge. I'll finish this with this quote from Toni Morrison: "The function of freedom is to free someone else."